So I want to take a little bit of time and talk about how we can put custom handlers into the pipeline, because this is really where a lot of the power of knowing the pipeline comes out. Every custom handler you write inherits from delegating handler. This is how we're going to wire it up to the pipeline. But the great thing is, once you've written a class and you've inherited delegating handler, then you can write custom code to perform any kind of per request functionality. And really, you're only limited by your imagination in a sense. If you can imagine your class is going to sit, kind of like a gateway that a request and a response have to pass through, so you can put code at this gateway to do whatever it is you want to do. You can check security, you can do logging, you can hit a database, you can add to the headers to show that this happened or that happened, or that it's coming from this person or coming from that person. You're only limited by your imagination, really, but you have this opportunity to have your very own hook into the pipeline. It's very powerful. You can even have a custom handler that opens up an in-Hibernate session or an Entity Framework data context or a database connection, and then closes it before the response is sent or after the response is sent. There's all kinds of interesting things you can do with these custom handlers. So custom handlers are a fairly abstract concept. They're relatively easy to understand at a high level, but it's really difficult to understand them unless we actually get into some code and write some that do some of these things we've been talking about. And then I'm going to show you how to wire them up into the pipeline. What I've got in front of me is a security handler, and we'll use this as a starting example, and then we will create one from scratch. But I just wanted to point out some of the features that we talked about. We have this security handler, and it inherits from delegating handler. Now, when you inherit from delegating handler, really the main method that you want to override is this one right here. It's the send asynchronous method. What you're going to get in this method is you're going to get the HTTP request message. Hey, this is coming down the pipeline, and you're getting the cancellation token coming out the pipeline. Does this need to be canceled or not? In this particular example, what we do is we take the request and we look to see if the request has the password in the query string. Here it takes the request URI, gets the query string, looks for a key of p-word, and looks to see if that's equal to 12345, incredibly secure password. And if it does equal, then it's true. If it doesn't equal, it's false. So what we've done is, if this turns out to be false, if this doesn't match up, if it doesn't validate, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a task, a response message. I'm going to start a new one. I'm not going to continue on down the chain. And I'm going to return a new response message where I say that the status code is forbidden. You don't have access to be here. When I wire this up to the pipeline, what's going to happen then is every request that comes through that does not have the password in the query string or has the wrong password in the query string, I'm going to get forbidden before that request even gets to the controller. It won't even execute. It won't even touch the controller dispatcher because I'm stopping it right here. If it is indeed fine, if it does validate, then we don't exit out or return anything. We just go ahead and return the base method. In other words, it's business as usual. Go ahead and do what you would normally do, which is going to send it further down the chain. Now, once you've written your own custom handler, and this is a pretty basic one, and I haven't done any logging or set off any alarms or the kinds of things you do when you have a security violation. But once you've written a handler, now you also have the responsibility of telling the web API that you want to add a handler to the pipeline. And the way to do that is pretty easy. In your application start in your global.asax, you just want to add it to your global configuration. And here's what that looks like. My global configuration.configuration message handlers add, and in here I'm going to add a new instance of my security handler. Okay, and now this is actually part of my pipeline. Okay. So if I bundle this guy up, make sure we build, okay. Go ahead and start up the web server. We get the default web API. Now, if I go ahead and just make an API request for book 1, it says the website declined to show you this web page. The most likely cause of Riccardi to log in. I got the 403. I got the 403 forbidden error from the HTTP because my message handler intercepted this. Now, if I add the security, p-word equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now I get a response back. All right, so I can open it up in Notepad. There's my data. So if you see how easy that is, you just write the handler, override this method, say what you want to do, and then tie it into the pipeline. You can simplify your tasks a lot, because imagine how I would do this if I couldn't add a custom handler to the pipeline. Well, what I would have to do is the message would get all the way to the controller, and in all of my controller methods, I'd have to check for that password, check for that password, check for that password to see if it could actually get through. Well, in this case, I just write my logic for security one time, stick it in the pipeline, it acts as a gate for every request that comes through, and I'm good. And all my logic can go here in one place. I'm not repeating anything or adding a lot of code I don't need. So if I decide I want to add logging to security, then I just add that in this block here. I don't have to go editing it in 50 different controllers where I wrote a security handler method or inherit from a weird base class or something like that. Okay, so now that you've seen how relatively easy this is to do, I want to go ahead and start adding some other kinds of handlers. Once again, these are all going to basically follow the same essential format, but I want to show you how we can write custom message handlers to do various kinds of things. A lot of this code you could reuse if you wanted to, but overall what I want to do is just provide you inspiration for writing your own logging code or your own kind of handling code. So let's take a scenario where I want to add a message to every header that comes in. Maybe, let's take this scenario. Let's say I'm working at a bank, and the bank has a lot of infrastructure in an AS400 mainframe. And people who are working on the mainframe are making changes to my data. But I also have a web application, and this web application is also making changes to my data. Now, banks have very stringent audit requirements. They have to know exactly who changed what and how. So how am I going to know if a request to change data or read data or whatever came from the web application versus coming directly from the AS400? Well, one of the things that I could do is add a message handler to put in the HTTP header that this request is actually coming from the web application. So let's do that. I'm going to come over here, and I'm just adding these in the controllers folder. From an enterprise architecture perspective, that may not be the best place to add them because, well, they're not controllers. What you might want to do is have a folder called infrastructure, or maybe have a folder for your message handlers and a folder for your filters. You know, but you don't want to just lump these all in with controllers. I'm just kind of doing that for convenience right now. So let's say I want to make an add website header. And I'll put handler on the end just so everybody knows what this is. Okay, so the first thing I have to do, like we've discussed, is I have to inherit from delegating handler. And that we are going to find this in the net HTTP namespace. All right. Now, in order for this to actually do something interesting, we need to override that one important method, send asynchronous. And that sets me up here. I don't usually like all this stuff, so I tend to delete it and put it up in using statements, but we don't need to go through all that. Same thing. Request message comes in, the cancellation token comes in. By default, it's just going to pass it on through without making any changes. So here's where I want to put my code to do something special with this. Okay. So what I'm going to do is actually add to the header. I'm going to, let's see, actually I'm going to keep the same thing here. I'm going to keep sending this down the chain. I'm not going to interrupt the chain. So I'm going to keep this. I'm just going to add a few steps to it. I'm going to take what it would normally do, the plain Jane vanilla, passing this on down the chain, and I'm going to say continue with. What this will allow me to do is keep passing it down the chain, but give it some additional instructions. Okay, so I'm just saying continue with, and here's the task, and now I'm going to populate this task. Okay, so right now I haven't returned anything, that's why it's all red there, but this is actually the correct syntax. So I'm just taking the default method that delegating handler has, and I'm saying, yeah, do this, don't stop anything, but I'm going to add a step to what you're going to do here. So I'm lined up my task, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make, let's see, I'm going to take the task's result that was generated, and I'm going to make this the response. This is an HTTP response message. I didn't explicitly put that there because I like var personally, but that's what it is. And I'm going to take the response, and I'm going to take its headers, and I'm going to add something to it as soon as I spell it correctly, and then I'm going to return the response. Okay? So I'm going to add, let's see, let's add, this is going to be sort of a name-value pair for a header. So I'm going to call this you can call it whatever you want, just so long as we can look for it later. And I'm going to say this came from the web API. And then it's going to return the response. Okay, so all I did is I took what it would do normally, I took the task that it would generate normally, and I added the header to the response. This came from the web API. So what this will allow us to do is, on the AS400 side, when it receives this HTTP request, it automatically has this header that tells it where it came from. And so it can fill out a field or something that says this came from the web API. This request came from something else. This request came from something else. All I'm doing is adding custom headers here. And so you can use this however you want. Maybe you have 10 different clients that use your services, so you want to add a header, a custom header to your request or your response saying where it came from, so you can log it under that company's database table or something. All different kinds of things you can do, but this is how I could do it, and it'll just keep going through the chain, hit the controller just like normal. To wire it up, I do the exact same thing. Except instead of a new security handler, now I'm going to instantiate my add website header handler. And now that's tied into my pipeline, so now that will be part of all my HTTP requests and responses. Now, as you can see, I'm already doing a lot messing around with global configuration. This is probably a good point to break it off into its own thing, so that I can keep all my configuration logic in one place. It's a little bit easier to deal with. So what I can do is just make like a private static void method, and you know, we can call it whatever we want here. Configure global, and I'm going to pass it in the HTTP configuration. And I'm going to take all of these guys. I'm going to move them down here. And I'm going to call this method here in my application start. And I'm just going to pass it the global configuration. Now I can get rid of some of this stuff. Makes it a little bit easier to read, makes it a little bit easier to see what's going on. And now all my configuration stuff is in one place. So it's not one-liners scattered all throughout my application start. I could even break this out into configuring the filters and configuring the message handlers if I want to. Whatever makes sense to you, but I just want to show you how you can wire this up without a lot of overhead and still keep it nice and organized. Once these messages are in here, they become part of the pipeline and they will get processed with every request and every response.